A continent without an owner. There is a place on Earth where the idea of ownership quietly breaks down. No flags permanently fly there, no borders are enforced, no government claims its people, because it has none. This place is Antarctica. It is easy to think of Antarctica as small, remote. An empty margin at the bottom of the map, but Antarctica is not small at all. In fact, Antarctica covers approximately 14 million square kilometers. That makes it larger than Europe, which spans about 10 million square kilometers, larger than Australia, almost 1.5 times the size of the United States. Only Asia and Africa are larger, and yet unlike every other continent of comparable size, Antarctica has no permanent population. Europe is home to over 740 million people, Africa to more than 1.4 billion. Even Australia, the smallest inhabited continent, supports over 26 million residents. Antarctica supports none. At any given time, the total human presence on the continent fluctuates between about 1,000 people in winter and roughly 4,000 in summer, almost all of them scientists or support staff. No one is born there permanently, no one retires there, no one becomes a citizen. This alone makes Antarctica unique. But its strangeness does not stop there. Antarctica is also the coldest place on Earth. The lowest temperature ever reliably recorded, -89.2 degrees Celsius, was measured there in 1983. It is the driest continent, receiving less precipitation than the Sahara Desert, and it is the windiest, with recorded gusts exceeding 300 kilometers per hour. Nearly 98% of its surface is covered by ice, holding about 70% of the world's fresh water. If all of that ice were to melt, global sea levels would rise by approximately 58 meters. No other continent carries consequences on that scale. And yet, despite its size, its water, and its global importance, Antarctica has never become a country. No capital city has been founded there, no parliament convenes on its soil, no borders divide it into states or provinces, which raises an unusual question. Why does this one continent, alone among all others, belong to no one? To answer that, it helps to compare Antarctica to the rest of the world. Every other continent has been divided through a familiar pattern. First comes discovery, then settlement, then governance, then ownership. Even places that were once considered uninhabitable eventually followed this sequence. Greenland, for example, is largely ice-covered and sparsely populated, yet it is formally governed and politically integrated. The Arctic Ocean is frozen for much of the year, but it is still divided into national zones under international law. Even the deep seabed, thousands of meters below the ocean's surface, is regulated through ownership-like agreements. Antarctica alone resisted this process, not because no one tried, but because the usual mechanisms of ownership simply did not work there. Unlike other continents, Antarctica offered no immediate economic incentive to early explorers. There were no civilizations to conquer, no farmland to cultivate, no trade routes to control. For centuries, it existed more as a theory than a place. Early maps showed a speculative southern landmass, Terra Australis Incognita, drawn not from observation, but from balance. Cartographers believed that land in the north must be counterweighted by land in the south. When explorers finally confirmed Antarctica's existence in the 19th century, what they found was not opportunity, but endurance. Expeditions lasted months or years. Ships were crushed by ice. Men died from cold, starvation, and isolation. Antarctica did not reward possession, it punished it. And yet by the early 20th century, several nations began to do something familiar. They began to claim it. Between 1908 and 1943, 7 countries formally asserted territorial claims over parts of Antarctica. Together, those claims covered roughly 80% of the continent. Some claims overlapped, some were never universally recognized, some were asserted with little more than a declaration and a map. But none of these claims resulted in full control. No claim led to settlement. No claim led to governance. No claim produced borders that were enforced on the ground. Compare this to Africa, where colonial claims quickly translated into administrations, infrastructure, and permanent presence. Or to North America, where territorial claims were rapidly followed by migration and state formation. Antarctica followed none of these paths. It remained physically unconquerable, logistically hostile, and politically awkward, because claiming land that no one can live on creates a problem. Ownership, in practice, requires more than a declaration. It requires continuous presence. Enforcement of rules, administration of people. Antarctica provided none of these conditions. By the mid-20th century, this ambiguity became dangerous. The world had entered the Cold War. Territory mattered not only for resources but for strategic positioning. Military bases appeared across the globe. Scientific research became entwined with national prestige. Remote regions were no longer ignored. Antarctica, despite its emptiness, suddenly mattered. It sat astride the Southern Ocean. It influenced global climate systems. It offered a platform, at least in theory, for surveillance, testing, or control. If one nation turned Antarctica into a military outpost, others would respond. If one nation exploited its resources, others would contest it. And unlike other regions, there was no existing legal framework to prevent this. So the world did something rare. Instead of competing for ownership, it agreed to suspend it. In 1959, 12 countries signed an agreement that changed Antarctica's fate. They did not divide the continent. They did not resolve competing claims. They did not establish a new nation. Instead, they froze the status quo. Territorial claims were neither recognized nor abolished. Military activity was prohibited. Scientific cooperation was prioritized. Antarctica would be used, but not owned. This made it the only continent governed by international agreement rather than national sovereignty. No other landmass operates this way. Even outer space, often compared to Antarctica, does not function identically. Satellites belong to countries. Space stations have national modules. Antarctica, by contrast, has no sovereign owner at all. And yet it is not lawless. Rules exist. Decisions are made. Access is controlled. Which brings us back to the central paradox. Antarctica is not owned, but it is governed. It is not sovereign, but it is regulated. It does not belong to anyone, yet many nations are present. So while Antarctica may be the only continent no one can own, it is not beyond control. An understanding that control requires us to look backward to the moment when nations first believed Antarctica could be claimed, because before the ice was protected by treaties, it was carved up on maps. And that story begins with flags planted in frozen ground. Gentle pause. If you enjoy slow, carefully researched histories like this, designed to inform without overwhelming, you're always welcome to stay. These episodes are made to be listened to calmly, without rushing. So now we ask the question that history demands. If Antarctica offered no cities, no people, and no immediate wealth, why did so many nations try to claim it in the first place? That answer lies in the age of exploration and ambition. And that is where we continue. Segment 2. The Age of Claims. Drawing lines on ice. By the beginning of the 20th century, Antarctica was no longer a blank space. It was still largely unexplored, still uninhabited, still impossibly hostile, but it was no longer unknown. Maps now showed a continent at the bottom of the world, vast, white, and clearly real. And once something appears on a map, it rarely remains untouched by politics. Between 1908 and 1943, a quiet but consequential process unfolded. One by one, nations began to claim Antarctica, not by building cities, not by settling populations, but by drawing lines, long triangular wedges, stretching from the South Pole outward to the sea. In total, 7 countries formally declared territorial claims over parts of Antarctica. Together, these claims covered approximately 80% of the continent's land area. To understand the scale of this, imagine Europe divided into 7 enormous slices, each claimed by a different nation, despite the absence of roads, towns, or residents. That is what Antarctica became on paper. The first formal claim came from the United Kingdom in 1908. At the time, Britain was still a global imperial power, accustomed to asserting control over distant territories. The British claim covered a vast region extending southward from the Atlantic-facing side of Antarctica. Measured in area, it was larger than India, but there were no administrators sent, no settlers arrived, no permanent government followed. The claim existed almost entirely as a legal declaration. Over the following decades, other countries followed. By 1943, claims had been made by the United Kingdom, New Zealand, France, Norway, Australia, Chile, Argentina. Each claim varied in size. Australia's claim was the largest, covering approximately 42% of Antarctica, an area larger than the entirety of Western Europe. France's claim, by contrast, was relatively small, about the size of Spain. Some claims were adjacent, others overlapped. The most notable overlaps occurred between Argentina, Chile, and the United Kingdom, whose claimed territories intersected over the Antarctic Peninsula. This overlap mattered because overlapping claims elsewhere in the world had historically led to conflict. Yet in Antarctica, conflict never erupted, not because tensions were absent, but because the continent resisted escalation. The physical reality of Antarctica imposed limits. No matter how large a claim looked on a map, enforcing it required presence. And presence in Antarctica was expensive, dangerous, and temporary. Even today, supplying a single research station can cost tens of millions of dollars per year. In the early 20th century, those costs were far higher relative to national budgets. Ships could reach the continent only seasonally, communication was unreliable, rescue was uncertain. Antarctica could be claimed, but not occupied in any meaningful sense. This made Antarctic claims fundamentally different from colonial claims elsewhere. When European powers claimed land in Africa or Asia, they followed claims with administration, extraction, and settlement. Antarctica offered none of that. No agriculture was possible, no indigenous labor force existed, no immediate resources could be exploited at scale. Even coal deposits discovered there were inaccessible. So why claim it at all? The answer lies not in what Antarctica was, but in what it symbolized. By the early 1900s, exploration had become a measure of national prestige. Reaching remote places demonstrated technological capability, scientific sophistication, and endurance. Antarctica became a proving ground. Planting a flag at the edge of the world was less about possession and more about presence. Claims were signals. They said, we can reach this place, we can survive here. We belong among the great powers. There was also an emerging awareness of Antarctica's potential future value. Although no large-scale resources could be extracted at the time, governments understood that technology changes. Coal, once useless, becomes valuable. Oil, once unreachable, becomes strategic. Antarctica's vast size made it impossible to ignore forever. In this sense, Antarctic claims were speculative. They were bets on the future. But these bets created a problem, because claims were not universally recognized. Some countries recognized certain claims, others rejected them outright. The United States and the Soviet Union, notably, never made formal territorial claims. Instead, they reserved the right to do so later. This ambiguity was deliberate. It allowed them to operate scientific missions without acknowledging the authority of any claimant nation. By mid-century, Antarctica existed in a legal limbo. Most of the continent was claimed, but none of those claims were enforceable. And some of the world's most powerful nations rejected the idea that Antarctica could be owned at all. This made Antarctica unlike any other claimed territory on Earth. It was divided on paper, but unified in practice. At the same time, scientific activity was increasing. During the International Geophysical Year of 1957-1958, over 60 research stations were established across Antarctica by 12 different countries. Scientists studied weather patterns, ice thickness, seismic activity, and Earth's magnetic field. This marked the first sustained multinational presence on the continent, and it exposed a contradiction. Scientists from rival nations worked side by side, often within claimed territories that their home countries did not recognize. A Soviet research station operated inside a British-claimed area. American scientists worked throughout the continent without acknowledging any claims at all. Antarctica functioned, but not according to ownership. This raised a question that governments could no longer avoid. If Antarctica was already being used cooperatively, what would happen if competition replaced cooperation? The Cold War intensified this concern. Nuclear weapons had changed the meaning of territory. Even remote places could become strategically significant. Antarctica's isolation, once a barrier, could become an asset. And yet, militarizing Antarctica would have been extraordinarily difficult and extraordinarily destabilizing. Any attempt to do so would likely provoke immediate response. The cost would be immense, the benefit uncertain. By the late 1950s, the world faced a choice: continue asserting claims that could not be enforced, or agree to stop asserting them altogether. What followed was one of the most unusual diplomatic decisions in modern history. Instead of settling claims, nations agreed to freeze them. Instead of dividing Antarctica, they agreed to share it without ownership. The age of claims would not end because claims were resolved. It would end because claims were suspended, and that decision would reshape Antarctica forever. But before we explore how that agreement came to be and what it actually says, we must pause at this turning point. Because Antarctica had reached a fragile balance, claimed but not owned, occupied but not governed, present in geopolitics yet outside sovereignty, a continent mapped by ambition on and restrained by reality. And so the question becomes unavoidable. If claims were never settled, how did Antarctica avoid becoming a battlefield? The answer lies in a treaty that did something no treaty had done before. And that is where we continue. Segment 3, the Antarctic Treaty, freezing the map. By the late 1950s, Antarctica had reached a moment of quiet tension. On paper, most of the continent was claimed. In reality, none of those claims were fully enforced. And beneath the surface, global politics were growing colder and sharper. The world was now divided by ideology. The United States and the Soviet Union faced each other across continents, oceans, and proxy conflicts. Military bases appeared across the globe. Science, once neutral, increasingly carried strategic weight. In this climate, Antarctica became an anomaly. Rival nations were already operating there, peacefully. Scientists from competing political systems shared weather data. Research stations operated within claimed territories without acknowledging those claims. Aircraft crossed invisible borders that existed only on maps. Antarctica was functioning, but without a rulebook. This worried diplomats because history suggested that ambiguity over territory rarely ends well. Elsewhere in the world, unresolved claims led to escalation. Competing presences hardened into conflict. Neutral spaces vanished. Antarctica, however, posed a unique challenge. Any attempt to impose sovereignty would be extraordinarily difficult. The logistics alone were overwhelming. Maintaining a permanent military presence in Antarctica would require continuous resupply across thousands of kilometers infrastructure capable of withstanding extreme cold, enormous financial investment. Even today, sustaining a single year-round research station can cost tens of millions of dollars annually. In the 1950s, those costs were proportionally far higher, and the strategic payoff was uncertain. Antarctica had no population to control, no trade routes to dominate, no immediate resources to exploit. The cost-benefit balance favored restraint. At the same time, science offered an alternative. During the International Geophysical Year of 1957-1958, cooperation in Antarctica reached an unprecedented level. 12 countries established stations across the continent. Data was shared openly, joint logistics were coordinated. This proved something important. Antarctica did not need ownership to function, it needed agreement. Recognizing this, diplomats began discussing a radical idea. What if Antarctica were removed entirely from normal concepts of sovereignty? What if claims were neither enforced nor abolished, but simply set aside? This idea became the foundation of what is now known as the Antarctic Treaty. Signed in 1959 by 12 nations, the treaty entered into force in 1961. Its core provisions were simple, but unprecedented. First, Antarctica would be used exclusively for peaceful purposes. Military activity, including weapons testing, troop deployment, and fortifications, was prohibited. Second, scientific investigation would be free and cooperative. Research data would be shared. Scientists could move freely. Stations could be inspected by other treaty members. Third, and most importantly, territorial claims would be frozen. This did not mean claims were erased. Countries that had made claims did not abandon them. Countries that rejected claims did not recognize them. Instead, all parties agreed that no new claims could be made, no existing claims could be expanded, no actions could strengthen or weaken existing claims. In effect, sovereignty was paused. Antarctica became the only place on Earth where the question of ownership was deliberately left unanswered. This was not compromise in the traditional sense, it was suspension. The treaty also banned nuclear explosions and radioactive waste disposal. At the height of the Cold War, this made Antarctica one of the world's first nuclear-free zones. Compared to other regions, this was extraordinary. Even space, governed by later treaties, still allows military satellites. The oceans permit naval forces. The Arctic hosts submarines and missile systems. Antarctica allows none of these. Instead, it operates on inspection and trust. Any treaty nation can inspect another's facilities at any time. No advance notice is required. Transparency replaces enforcement. This system works because everyone has the same incentive. If one nation violates the agreement, others can respond collectively. But as long as everyone complies, no one bears the cost of militarization. Over time, the treaty expanded. Today, more than 50 countries are parties to it. Some are consultative members, meaning they have decision-making power because they conduct significant scientific research in Antarctica. Others are non-consultative members who agree to the rules but do not vote. This creates a quiet hierarchy, not of ownership, but of participation. To compare it to something familiar, Antarctica is not governed like a country. It is governed more like a shared research campus the size of a continent. Rules exist, meetings are held, decisions are made by consensus, but no one issues laws over citizens because there are no citizens. No taxes are collected, no elections are held. Antarctica exists outside the structures we normally associate with governance, and yet it functions. Environmental protections were added later, including a comprehensive ban on mineral mining. This ban is particularly significant. Geological surveys suggest Antarctica may contain valuable resources, coal, iron ore, and possibly hydrocarbons, but extracting them would be prohibitively difficult. More importantly, it would violate the agreement that keeps Antarctica stable. So instead of becoming a frontier of extraction, Antarctica became a reserve, a place where economic activity is deliberately limited. This sets it apart not only from other continents, but from nearly every other region on Earth. Even the Amazon rainforest, protected by national laws, exists within sovereign states. Antarctica exists outside sovereignty altogether. This makes it fragile, because the treaty works only as long as nations continue to agree. There is no global police force in Antarctica. No army enforcing compliance, only inspections, diplomacy, and shared interest. So far, that has been enough. For over 6 decades, Antarctica has remained free of war. No shots have been fired in territorial disputes. No borders have hardened. In a world defined by division, that is remarkable, but it also raises a subtle question. If Antarctica is governed by agreement, who actually holds power there? Who decides what research is allowed? Who regulates tourism? Who enforces environmental rules? The answer is not a single nation. It is a system, a network of meetings, committees, inspections, and consensus. Power in Antarctica is quiet. It comes not from ownership, but from presence, from maintaining stations, from contributing science, from participating consistently, which brings us to the present day, because Antarctica today is not empty. People are there, ships arrive, aircraft land, and while no one owns the continent, some nations are far more involved than others. So the question shifts again. If sovereignty is frozen, who is actually there now, and what influence does presence bring? That is where the story continues. Segment 4. Who is actually there? Power without ownership. Antarctica may have no citizens and no sovereign government, but it is not empty. At any given moment, people are living and working on the continent, maintaining stations, collecting data, and keeping a quiet human presence alive in one of the most extreme environments on Earth. This presence, though temporary and limited, is the key to understanding how power operates in Antarctica without ownership. The number of people in Antarctica changes with the seasons. During the austral summer, from November to March, the population rises to roughly 4,000 individuals. In winter, when temperatures drop further and darkness lasts for months, that number falls to about 1,000. These figures are small when compared to even the smallest countries, yet they represent a continuous human footprint on a continent larger than Europe. These people are not settlers. They are scientists, engineers, pilots, medics, mechanics, and support staff. They live in research stations that function more like isolated industrial facilities than towns. There are no families, no permanent homes, and no long-term communities. When a posting ends, people leave. The station remains, waiting for the next rotation. As of today, more than 70 permanent or seasonal research stations operate across Antarctica. They are run by around 30 countries, though a smaller number account for most of the activity. The distribution of these stations is not random. They are concentrated in areas that are relatively accessible, particularly along the Antarctic Peninsula and the coastal regions of East Antarctica. Some stations operate year-round, others are used only during the summer months. A year-round station requires extensive infrastructure, power generation, heating systems, food storage, medical facilities, and reliable communications. Maintaining such a station can cost tens of millions of dollars annually. This financial commitment is significant, and it shapes who can maintain a continuous presence on the continent. In practice, the countries with the largest and most advanced stations tend to have the greatest influence within the Antarctic Treaty system. This influence does not come from legal ownership. It comes from participation, investment, and continuity. Under the treaty, only consultative members have decision-making authority. To become a consultative member, a country must demonstrate substantial scientific activity in Antarctica. This usually means operating a research station or conducting major expeditions. As a result, presence translates directly into voice. Countries without stations can still be treaty members, but they do not vote on key decisions. This creates a system where power is not tied to territory, but to contribution. The more a nation invests in Antarctic science and logistics, the more influence it gains over how the continent is managed. The largest presence belongs to a small group of countries. The United States operates several major stations, including the largest facility on the continent. Russia maintains multiple long-standing stations across different regions. China has expanded its Antarctic program significantly in recent decades, adding new stations and logistical capabilities. Australia, because of its geographic proximity and its large territorial claim, also plays a central role, maintaining multiple stations in East Antarctica. These countries do not own the land their stations sit on. They cannot restrict access to others, and they cannot enforce national laws beyond their own personnel. Any station can be inspected by other treaty members at any time without notice. This openness is a core feature of the system and a safeguard against hidden military or commercial activity. Despite this, presence still matters. A station is not just a building, it is a logistical hub. It provides airstrips, ports, fuel storage, and emergency support. Other nations often rely on these facilities, creating informal networks of dependence and cooperation. This is how influence emerges in Antarctica. Not through borders or armies, but through infrastructure. Scientific research is the primary justification for this presence. Antarctica plays a critical role in understanding global climate systems. Ice cores extracted from the Antarctic ice sheet contain records of Earth's atmosphere, going back hundreds of thousands of years. These records are essential for studying climate change, greenhouse gas concentrations, and long-term environmental cycles. Antarctica also affects global ocean circulation. The cold, dense water formed around the continent sinks and drives deep ocean currents that influence climate far beyond the polar regions. What happens in Antarctica does not stay in Antarctica. It affects sea levels, weather patterns, and ecosystems worldwide. Because of this, scientific research in Antarctica is not neutral in its consequences. It shapes global understanding and policy. Countries that lead this research help define what is known, what is measured, and what is prioritized. Tourism adds another layer to Antarctica's modern reality. Each year, tens of thousands of tourists visit the continent, almost all of them arriving by ship. Most land briefly, guided by strict regulations designed to minimize environmental impact. There are no hotels, no permanent tourist facilities, and no private land ownership. Tourism is allowed, but tightly controlled under the treaty's environmental rules. Even so, the growth of tourism raises questions. Increased human activity brings increased risk, fuel spills, wildlife disturbance, and accidents in remote areas where rescue is difficult. Managing these risks requires coordination and oversight, further reinforcing the importance of the treaty system and the nations most involved in its administration. Environmental protection is one of the most significant areas of governance in Antarctica. All human activity is subject to environmental impact assessments. Waste must be removed from the continent. Wildlife is protected. Certain areas are designated as specially protected or managed zones, where access is restricted to preserve ecosystems or scientific value. These rules are not enforced by a single authority. Instead, they are enforced through mutual monitoring and diplomatic pressure. If a country violates the rules, others can raise the issue through treaty mechanisms. The system relies on reputation and long-term interest rather than punishment. This approach works because Antarctica is expensive. Any country operating there has already invested heavily. Risking exclusion or loss of trust would undermine that investment. Compliance is, therefore, in everyone's interest. Still, this system is not perfectly balanced. Not all countries have equal capacity to participate. Operating in Antarctica requires ships capable of breaking ice, aircraft suited to extreme cold, and specialized personnel. As a result, a relatively small group of technologically advanced nations shapes most decisions. This raises an important distinction. Antarctica is not owned by anyone, but it is not equally accessible to everyone. Control in practice flows toward those who can afford to be there consistently. This does not mean the system is unfair by design. It reflects physical reality. Antarctica is not a place where influence can be exercised cheaply or casually. Presence is costly, and cost creates hierarchy. As the 21st century progresses, this hierarchy is becoming more visible. Some countries are expanding their Antarctic programs, building new stations and investing in logistics. Others maintain a minimal presence or withdraw entirely. At the same time, global interest in Antarctica is growing. Climate change has made the continent more relevant than ever. Melting ice, rising sea levels, and changing ecosystems draw attention from scientists, policymakers, and the public. This increased attention places pressure on the system that governs Antarctica. More activity means more coordination. More coordination means more influence for those who are already present. And yet, despite these pressures, Antarctica remains what it has been for decades, a continent without ownership, governed by cooperation rather than sovereignty. The question is whether this model can endure. Because while Antarctica has avoided conflict so far, the forces shaping the world around it are changing. Economic pressures are rising. Environmental stakes are increasing, technological capabilities are expanding. All of these factors point toward the future. And that future brings us to the final question. If Antarctica belongs to no one and is controlled by agreement rather than power, can it remain protected as global pressures intensify? That is where the story leads next. Segment 5. The Future of a Continent. No one can own. Antarctica has remained without an owner for more than 60 years. In a world where almost every piece of land is governed, taxed, and defended, that fact alone is remarkable. The question now is not how Antarctica avoided ownership in the past, but whether it can continue to do so in the future. The forces acting on the continent today are stronger than they were when the Antarctic Treaty was signed. Climate change, technological advancement, and global demand for resources have altered the context in which Antarctica exists. None of these pressures were fully understood in 1959. All of them matter now. Antarctica is warming, though not evenly. Parts of East Antarctica remain extremely cold and relatively stable. In contrast, the Antarctic Peninsula has experienced some of the fastest warming on the planet. Average temperatures in parts of the peninsula have risen by several degrees Celsius over the last half-century. This warming has contributed to the collapse of several ice shelves, large floating extensions of the ice sheet that help slow the flow of land-based ice into the ocean. When ice shelves collapse, they do not directly raise sea levels because they are already floating, but they remove a barrier. Glaciers behind them begin to move faster, pushing more ice into the sea. This process matters globally. As noted earlier, Antarctica holds roughly 70% of the world's fresh water locked in ice. Even a small percentage of that ice entering the ocean would have dramatic consequences. Current estimates suggest that if the entire Antarctic ice sheet were to melt, global sea levels would rise by around 58 meters. This is not a near-term scenario, but it illustrates why Antarctica's stability is so important. Sea level rise of even 1 meter would affect hundreds of millions of people living in coastal regions around the world. These realities give Antarctica a new kind of value, not as territory, but as a regulator of Earth's systems. Protecting the continent is no longer just about preserving a remote wilderness. It is about protecting coastlines, cities, and economies far beyond the polar regions. At the same time, technological change has reduced some of the barriers that once made Antarctica effectively untouchable. Modern icebreakers are more powerful. Aircraft can land on ice runways with greater reliability. Satellite communication has reduced isolation. What once required heroic endurance can now be achieved through engineering and funding. This does not mean Antarctica is becoming easy to access. It remains one of the most expensive places on Earth to operate, but it does mean that more countries are capable of sustaining a presence there than in the past. As more actors become involved, the treaty system faces increased strain. The Antarctic Treaty was designed to prevent military conflict and territorial competition. It was not designed to manage large-scale environmental change or intense geopolitical rivalry. One of the most closely watched provisions of the treaty system is the ban on mineral resource extraction. This ban was formalized in 1991 through an environmental protocol that prohibits mining in Antarctica indefinitely. The ban can only be lifted by unanimous agreement of the consultative parties. Geological surveys suggest that Antarctica may contain significant mineral resources, including coal and iron ore. There is also speculation about oil and gas reserves offshore. At present, extracting these resources would be economically and environmentally impractical. But economics change, energy transitions shift. What is uneconomical today may become tempting tomorrow. The existence of these resources creates a latent tension. As long as the ban remains in place and respected, Antarctica stays free from extraction. But the ban depends entirely on political will. There is no enforcement mechanism beyond collective agreement. This is where the concept of ownership becomes relevant again. Ownership is not just about legal title, it is about responsibility and restraint. Antarctica has avoided ownership precisely because no single nation could be trusted to act solely in its own interest without harming others. The treaty system represents a rare moment when nations chose restraint over advantage. The question is whether that restraint can survive a future defined by scarcity and competition. Another pressure comes from tourism. Antarctic tourism has grown steadily over the past few decades. Tens of thousands of visitors now travel to the continent each year, primarily during the summer months. While tourism is carefully regulated, each landing increases the risk of environmental disturbance. Tourism also changes perception. Antarctica becomes less abstract, less distant. As more people see it with their own eyes, public interest grows. With interest comes attention, and with attention comes political pressure. Some argue that greater public awareness strengthens protection. Others worry it normalizes human presence and makes further activity easier to justify. Both views reflect the delicate balance Antarctica must maintain. There is also the question of governance itself. The Antarctic Treaty operates by consensus. Every major decision requires agreement among the consultative parties. This has ensured stability, but it also makes change slow. Consensus works well when interests align. It becomes more difficult when priorities diverge. As climate impacts accelerate and global politics shift, maintaining unanimous agreement may become harder. Despite these challenges, Antarctica's record is strong. For more than 6 decades, the continent has remained demilitarized. Scientific cooperation has continued through periods of intense global tension. Even during the Cold War, rival powers worked side by side on the ice. This history suggests that Antarctica is not just an exception. It is a precedent. It demonstrates that shared governance, while fragile, is possible. The future of Antarctica will depend on whether the world continues to see it as a shared responsibility rather than an opportunity. This is not guaranteed. Treaties are products of their time. They survive only as long as they are maintained. Antarctica's lack of ownership has been its greatest protection. It has prevented conquest, exploitation, and division. But it has also made the continent dependent on cooperation. In the end, Antarctica forces a question that extends beyond its ice and snow. It asks whether humanity can collectively protect something that no one owns. It asks whether restraint can outlast ambition, and it asks whether a place that belongs to no one can still matter to everyone. If Antarctica belongs to no nation, its future rests not in borders or flags, but in decisions made far from the ice, in meeting rooms and negotiations guided by science and long-term thinking. The continent has no voice of its own. It cannot defend itself. It relies entirely on the choices of those who study it, visit it, and govern it from afar. So the final question remains: Antarctica is the only continent no one can own. But as the world changes, can it remain a continent that everyone is willing to protect?